sign into my Google account. Should be. Should take it right to it.
Come on now. It says it's live.
That'd be great.
4 minutes. Yeah. Because it's streaming.
Yeah, but it shouldn't. It should take them right to that page. This is on.
Yeah, it's here.
YouTube.
Yeah, there you go. Live. Go. Check. Check. Tell me if you hear anything.
I hear talk in the background.
Yeah.
But this can't be the same link I'm using.
Probably not.
Okay.
But
What's it called? The name of the presentation? Emanuel.
yeah.
What is it?
You may send it to me.
Uh, 803 605 07 0780. Almost forgot. Yeah.
Here is the sync button. Which one is it?
It's you gotta open the. It's got a battery pack here. Can you mute these?
So,
So, okay, 529. So should I take that down?
45 minutes.
yeah. Now, what? Tell me how Jan Simmons fits in. Are we still showing the film? Or?
Yeah, so she can get here at the start of it, so we're gonna do it at the end.
At the end, okay.
So, when y'all are done, I'm gonna call Ms. Glover and she wants to say something. And then after that,
So she will do that after the audience has
yeah,
Q&A?
after the end of the book talk, after we've done some Q&A.
Yep.
Then
It's going for it.
So the preview happens after the Q&A. So give me a cue. We should be done with all Q&A. By what time? Q&A should be done by 6 p.m. Okay, all right.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have your cell phones, please mute them. Please take this opportunity to mute your cell phones.
Yeah. I don't have a good at all. Okay.
I got big boys.
All right, welcome everyone. Got Mike. Test, test. All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Allen University. Welcome to the Waverly Clyburn Auditorium. It's a pleasure to see so many of you out here today for this very special event honoring the Emanuel Nine. My name is Kevin Trumpeter. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities here, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guests who are going to be running the book talk this evening. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If anybody needs a bathroom anytime during the presentation, they're right outside. Just walk up through the exit there, and they're right on your right. Beyond that, I would like to first, well, I want to make sure to acknowledge and thank All Good Books for making this event possible, for bringing the author in and really reaching out and getting the ball rolling on this. We appreciate that partnership. And as always, Dr. Bobby Donaldson and University of South Carolina's Center for Civil Rights History and Research. Been a very good friend, partnered on a lot of things with Allen University, and we're very proud to be able to continue working with them on events like this. So without too much further ado, this is of course Dr. Bobby Donaldson. He's the director of the University of South Carolina Center for Civil History Research, and this is our guest, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Kevin Sack. He is the author of the book Mother Emanuel, and so he will be available afterwards. If you didn't get a chance to buy a book, please make sure you do that before leaving, but he'll be available afterwards to sign books and greet you. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Donaldson take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Trumpeter and Allen University and the Boeing Institute for hosting us. In case you did not know where you were, welcome to the Good Samaritan Waverly Hospital on the campus of Allen University, a historic space. And it's fitting then that we have a conversation about a monumental church on a monumental campus. If I can think of two spaces that really embody the trajectory of the AME Church in South Carolina, they would be Mother Emanuel, African Methodist Episcopal Church, 110 Calhoun Street in Charleston, and the great Allen University. So Kevin, thank you for making the journey back to Columbia, and thank you for bringing all of us together to talk about this great book. I especially want to thank the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, and to look across the room and see some amazing interns who are here this summer joining us, who are from North Carolina A&T, from Spelman College, and from Claflin University. Just stand up so people can see who you are. These are the newest members of our Civil Rights Center team. So at the University of South Carolina, I have been accused of not throwing things away. And so we have tremendous archives that Kevin has explored, but I also have a tendency never to delete emails. So I want to begin the conversation tonight to explain to you how ironic it is the two of us are sitting together. The date was June 16th, 2015. June 16th, 2015, 1 month after the tragedy at Mother Emanuel.
June or July?
July 16th,
July 16th, okay.
2015. 3:24 p.m. Hi, Dr. Donaldson. I'm Kevin Sack, a reporter with the New York Times based in Atlanta. I've been referred to you by several folks because I've been kicking around ideas for a project of some kind, possibly a book, that would attempt to place the massacre at Emanuel AME in the context of the church's remarkable history. And then he says, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe your specialty is South Carolina civil rights history. If so, I'm interested in anything you might know or sources you might point me regarding Emanuel's role in the movement, and particularly about its pastor from 1953 to 1965, B.J. Glover, who I know was also important in the NAACP of Charleston. And then there's more. I had no idea. In that email exchange, and then later at a coffee conversation at Immaculate Consumption behind the State House, that we would be here today, and that almost 10 years later, this book that was just a possibility is now before us. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Important milestone.
Thank you. Well, I gotta jump in there and thank you, not only for being here, but for answering that email and for having coffee that day, because you've been invaluable to this research, as has your center and the university. There are pictures in this book that come straight from the time that I've spent with you and all sorts of information, and particularly about Reverend Glover, whose daughter is here with us today, I'm happy to say. It's great to have you here, Gail. So thank you, and before we move on, just thank you to Alan, and thank you to All Good Books for making this happen, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I really appreciate it.
Well, I would like to begin our conversation. Now, I have 200 questions based on this book, and I only have 25 minutes, I'm told. But I like to begin the question with the bookends. I want to begin with the first sentence, and I want to begin with the last sentence. Your first sentence is this: preachers like to proclaim from the pulpit that the doors of the church are always open. The doors of the church are always open until June 15th, 2015. Your last line of your book is, the doors of the church are no longer always open. So in between your first sentence and your last sentence, you describe 2 centuries of history at one church that you describe as a captivating saga of resistance. So to begin, let's talk about the first sentence and the last sentence.
Okay.
Why do you begin that way, and why do you end that way?
It's a great question. The point I make at the beginning is that we've all heard preachers say this, right? The doors of the church are open, and I think we all have a general sense for what that means, that there's no barrier to joining the body of Christ, right? That anybody can become a person of faith at any point in their journey on this earth. The doors are always open. The doors of the physical church may be closed from time to time. They have office hours. But more generally, as we think about the church writ large, it's a global welcome was the intent of the statement. But then I go on to say that in the Black church, it takes on extra meaning. That it's an assertion of defiance, of resistance, of a vow that the doors will stay open despite all efforts at repression, at limiting and restricting the form and style of worship. And I finished the paragraph by saying that even when Molotov cocktails are secreted beneath church stairwells, as happened in Birmingham, or when Molotov cocktails are thrown through stained glass windows, the doors of the church still stay open. And you're right, that changed in a very real way on the 15th of June, because what happened that day was that there was a literal open door to the fellowship hall at Emanuel AME Church, and a 21-year-old white supremacist walked in. There are videotapes from the security camera mounted on the outside of the church that show him pulling up in his car, getting out casually, sort of checking the fanny pack that held his weapon, walking right through the door. There was no obstacle to him getting in the church that day. And as we all know, he was welcomed. As soon as he walked in, offered a Bible and a study sheet, given a chair next to the pastor, where he sat more or less silently for 45 minutes.
And all that's played out in the first 2 chapters, not to give too much away. All of that takes place at 110 Calhoun Street. And rather than simply speaking about what took place on June 15th, you decided to remind readers of a much deeper and richer history of the church that precedes that date. You have described Mother Emanuel as a unique vantage point, simultaneously microscopic and panoramic, for surveying 2 centuries of African American life in Charleston and by extension across my native South. So let's unpack that for the audience. How is or why is Mother Emanuel a window into the history of this country?
That's really what animated this entire project, was that notion that the church could be used as a vehicle, the life of the church, the history of the church could be used as a vehicle to tell this broader story of African American life over a 200-year period in Charleston, the city that may be more vital to African American history in this country than any other. I guess you can make an argument about it, but I'll stick with the assertion. Between the fact that I think it's 46% of all enslaved Africans who disembarked in North America did so in the port of Charleston, and then obviously the Civil War began there. But it was really as I started to learn a little bit about the church's history and see that there was something significant, something illustrative, illuminating going on at the church or around the church or involving the leadership of the church, coursing through every significant period of African American history from really before the time of its origins all the way through 2020, which is essentially when I end the narrative. And one of the most fortunate things was that not only was there activity at the church that I could use to sort of explore that era, there was often a leader at the church who represented the times, whether it was Morris Brown, who led the initial walkout from mainline Methodist churches and then created the African church, which was the forebearer of Emanuel, and was really an incredibly subversive act for the times, 1817, 1818. Denmark Vesey, we all know his story, said to be a member of the African church. And more importantly, almost more important than whether he was a member, the trials that followed the discovery of the purported Vesey insurrection plot led to 35 hangings. Almost half of them were folks who were associated with the church. And then you move on to Reconstruction. Richard Harvey Kane was the pastor who was an AMA missionary who came down from the north to revive the church after the end of the Civil War. He goes on to become one of 16 African American Southerners elected to Congress as Republicans during Reconstruction. So I was able to use his life to tell the whole story of Reconstruction, both this incredible promise at the end of the war, and then the crushing deflation of that promise, a dozen years or so later. And moving on, we see the church's pulpit was visited by Booker T. Washington in 1909, W.B. Du Bois in 1921, Dr. King in 1962, Coretta Scott King in 1969. So again, through their words and their activities, I was able to trace the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era. On to Reverend Glover, who not only was the pastor of the church for 12 very important years, but also was the branch president of the Charleston NAACP at the same time. And Gail's sister Ovita was one of the first students to desegregate the schools in Charleston because of his agitation and his litigation. So I was just astonished at how much of the history of African American life in Charleston it seemed you could tell without ever leaving this one institution.
So here's a point of confession. When Kevin and I had coffee at Immaculate Consumption, he talked about this proposal that one church could embody 2 centuries of history. And I was like, dude, ain't no way that can happen. I stand corrected. And part of the reason I was a little skeptical is I knew of the archives at Mother Emanuel, and later knew it even more deeply. So there was another email I have from a woman named Liz Alston, And Liz Alston was the church historian at Mother Emanuel. And she wrote me, and it was not a request, it was a demand, that the Center for Civil Rights History assist Mother Emanuel in placing the church on the National Register of Historic Places. And that took place in 2018. And so we had a chance to see what was a limited archive at the church. And I'm knowing Kevin is digging for material. So what you'll see in the book is someone who has mastered the archives at Mother Emanuel, but really gone far beyond that church's collection. So the book has been described as meticulous in its research. And so, Kevin, this might be a question for the graduate students in the room, because it is a dissertation. Let's talk about your research methods.
Yeah.
How did you go about finding so much amazing material that all points back to Mother Emanuel?
Well, did you tell me that day how sparse the archives were at Emanuel? Because if you had, maybe I would have gone home and found something else to do.
I believe in Hebrews 11:1. Now,
Yeah,
faith is.
right. Well, yeah, I had to discover it on my own. Well, let's start there. So the church does have an archive. It's literally a room in a building, a ramshackle building next door. They made, a diligent attempt at organizing it and preserving documents a few years ago. It's hit or miss, let's put it that way. And I wound up just spending weeks and weeks in the room, literally just going through boxes. Some of the papers had been filed properly. Some of it literally were just boxes of records thrown in corners, waiting for somebody to do something with them. And I have been begging the church to take better care of these records. The building that they're in is a fire trap, and I would often find a homeless man on the metal grate outside of the door to the building, surrounded by cigarette butts from the night before. One day I was in the room, it was the middle of winter, and there's a wall air conditioning heating unit, and it started to get cold, and I pushed the button and flames literally started flying out of the unit. So I'm hopeful that that some effort might be made to put these records in a place where they can be taken care of. But that said, spent a lot of time there. I spent a lot of time in the state archives here, going through records. Used all of the libraries in Charleston substantially, Avery, the public library, the South Carolina Historical Society collections, and also some collections elsewhere around the country. I was astonished at how much I could do without ever leaving my laptop. Yeah, I don't know how anybody did this work before digitization. This took me 10 years. It would have taken 30 had I not been able to go online and tap in a few words into a search engine. And as an example of the kinds of discoveries that we're now able to make that we didn't make before, I can't take credit for this, unfortunately. I would have loved to have been the person that discovered it, but for much of Emanuel's history, the legend was that after the Vesey insurrection trials, the church was burned to the ground in this dramatic conflagration ordered by the authorities. Well, another researcher, Ethan Keidel, who wrote a terrific book several years ago with his wife called Denmark Vesey's Garden, plugged African church into various search engines, and up popped ads from the Charleston newspapers of August of 1822 saying that placed by an auctioneer, all the lumber from the African church shall be sold at auction on this date and at this place. So it was taken apart board by board. Every indication is from that. And so you make a discovery like that, and you start to think, well, how do I narrate this? What actually happened here? And what I imagine happening, there's no absolute evidence for it, but I think suggestion is strong is that the authorities ordered that the building be destroyed. I can see the founders of the church, the trustees of the church saying, can we at least keep the lumber and sell it? And being allowed to, and then having to take this place apart, nail by nail, that they had built with their own hands just 4 years earlier. And while that may not be as dramatic as the fire, I think it may even be more painful to think about that with their own hands they had to take this place apart.
So in addition to the amazing narrative, what I found also fascinating was the endnotes, footnotes, where you outline all the amazing material you've explored. So in the course of the research, was there one find that you found particularly fascinating or revealing, or just really excited you upon the discovery?
Several. Well, I'll start with a source that I give a lot of credit to, and that you find all through the footnotes, is the Christian Recorder, which was the AME newspaper. Still is the AME newspaper. Founded, I believe, shortly after the Civil War. I may be wrong about the date. Maybe it was shortly before the Civil War, but it was in place and up and running at the time that these AME missionaries headed south to rebuild the church in Charleston, and the church that became Emanuel. And these pastors, these ministers who came down, sent back dispatches on a regular basis, and the pages of the Christian Recorder just filled with these reports, and they're really vivid. Not just about the life of the church, how many new members and how many baptisms, and we did this and we had this picnic, and but also with the life of Charleston. Incredibly valuable. In terms of a single find, finding the deeds for the purchase of the property, both on Calhoun Street and the prior property for the African church, which was on Charleston Neck on the corner of Hanover and Reed Streets, was super exciting. Not only just to see the actual things in print, and they're handwritten in these big weighty bound volumes in the Register of Deeds office in Charleston, but it also was great because they had names, right? They had the names of the trustees who bought the property, which I was then able to take as a starting point and go figure out who they were. And then the deed for the sale of the property in 1865, which happened, I believe, in September of 1865, showing how quickly this church this institution got revived and established. They're already buying property almost halfway through the year. The seller of the property on Calhoun Street was a gentleman named George Alfred Trenholm. And Civil War historians in the crowd will know that he was the Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederate States of America at the close of the war. Amazing turn. Trenholm, yeah.
No, that's
Trenholm.
people in Colombo know Trenholm.
Fortunately, I didn't read the book. I didn't do the audio. So amazing reversal of fortunes, right? You've got the Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederate States of America in prison in Georgia. Hugely wealthy man with business interests of all kinds, including shipping and cotton, big slaveholder, and his financial empire is now crumbling to the point where he's having to divest himself of property in a hurry. And he winds up selling land to a group that forms the first independent, autonomous black church in Charleston, South Carolina. Pretty cool.
So in that independent church, you paint a fascinating, intriguing portrait of the members of Mother Emanuel, the pastors and leaders of Mother Emanuel. And those who read the book have deeper insights about someone who was described as the ultimate agitator, Dr. B.J. Glover, who served as president of this university twice. We learned more about Wanda Sanders, who attended Allen University, Reverend Daniel Simmons, class of 1967 at Allen University, and of course, the pastor of Mother Emanuel at that time, Clemente Pinckney, and Jack, class of what? 1994. Let's talk about the personality of Mother Emanuel and how this book gives a deeper insight into the people who built and sustained that congregation well before June 15, 2015.
Well, first of all, yes, it's profound to be here with those beautiful new busts outside commemorating all those folks. And yes, there's a very tight connection, needless to say, between Emanuel and between that particular group of victims and this university. Any number of them were graduates. Taiwanza had graduated recently. There's a picture in the book of him on his graduation day with his parents in his Allen cap and robe. As I mentioned before, I mean, I hang a lot of the story on these personalities, and they were dynamos to a one. I mean, incredibly fearless, courageous, ambitious, energetic men. And they were men. The AME denomination is remarkably patriarchal, still is. Was only in 1960, I believe.
Yeah, what did you just say? AME Church is what?
Patriarchal.
I'm just looking, I didn't hear what you just said.
No amens. I guess like all churches everywhere, to some extent, it's the women who do most of the work, and it's the men who wear the robes and the collars. That's changed. That's changed somewhat, but it was 1960 when ordination was first allowed for women. It was only, I believe, in 2000 that the first female bishop was elected. But anyway, I divert. So yes, what they all have in common is this notion of using the pulpit as a platform for activism, and that often didn't sit well inside the church. Gail's father came up against all kinds of opposition internally because of his activities, and you can understand it. Again, you know, a church had been destroyed by dynamite in Birmingham, and 4 little girls had been killed. So the kinds of activities that he was endorsing and leading out of the church, I mean, the marches in Charleston literally started from the fellowship hall, the same room where the shootings happened, and demonstrators would return to that room for lunch of bologna sandwiches and then head out again. It posed a real threat to the congregation, and there were congregants who let him know about that, and did not seem to bother him a whit, from what I can tell. He charged on. He had a real conviction about what was right and wrong, and a real frustration, I think, that it was it was the 1960s and change still had not happened, and he was tired of waiting. He was going to make something happen, and he did. But it's hard for me not to go on talking about him because I think he's my favorite character in the book, and the story that I love most about him, that I think goes to the heart of who he was there's no sure date on this, but the Glovers lived in the parsonage on Rutledge Street, and they would have to take their laundry past a very nice whites only laundrette down the street to a segregated black facility that was shabby. And this really rubbed him the wrong way. I'm going to take it. And he walks down to the white laundrette, and he walks in like he owns the place. And of course, the customers inside are horrified, and they immediately go to the manager, and he just as immediately calls the cops, and an officer shows up as Reverend Glover is loading his sheets and towels and stuff into the washer. And the cop says, you know, what are you doing? You know you can't be here. And Glover just looks at him and says, but officer, look at the sign right there on the wall. It says whites only. That's all I got. And he opens up the tumbler to show him, you know, kind of doubles down on it. That was B.J. Glover. Was that B.J. Glover? That was B.J. Glover. Yeah. And the way he finishes the story is that the cop just looks at him. I'm leaving out the word, but yes, there was another word thrown in there. And then went back and reported on this to friends and folks in the community, and that it effectively desegregated the facility. The people kept coming, and now I sort of suspect that maybe this was happening in '64, just as the Civil Rights Act went into effect, because he also had a habit of testing that law. Immediately afterwards, would go into hotels and restaurants in Charleston and wait to get kicked out, which he did at times. And so I sort of wonder if this wasn't all part of the same campaign, but hard to know.
You said leave that preacher alone. So the Glover that I read about in the book is someone I knew and helped to sort of document his career. There's another preacher in the book who I thought I knew. I really thought I knew Clemente Pinckney. But I read things in this book that gives a very different angle on his career. And you really show someone who is far more tragic and challenged than I imagined and knew. In fact, you even talk about the very night of the tragedy of Mother Emanuel, there was a church conference meeting, and he was indicted by the congregation for his failures as pastor.
Right.
So let's talk about someone we thought we knew,
Yeah.
and what is the portrait you seek to paint of Clemente Pinckney in this narrative?
Well, I don't know that he's a different person than the one that we think we knew. I think he was, you know, he's still the same prodigy that we think we knew. An incredible talent, bright, ambitious, personable, amazing speaking voice, profoundly, was always listened to profoundly by his colleagues, I think, and respected by his colleagues. But he was spread thin, and arguably too thin. And it's easy to understand. I mean, he lived up here, right? You know, outside of town, Lexington County, and his work was at the Capitol. His other work was 2 hours south at the church in Charleston. His district stretched 2 hours south of there, all the way to the Georgia border. So he was constantly just ping-ponging back and forth, and it had to be exhausting. He put hundreds of thousands of miles on his car. Was often running late, you know, when he did get somewhere. His secretaries would tell me that, you know, he would show up at the end of meetings that he had called himself, you know, because he just couldn't get there. And the day that he died was really instructive, remarkable. He got up, it's not clear exactly when, but way before the crack of dawn, drove to Charleston in time to make a 7 a.m. meeting with an insurance salesman, because the church's property insurance had to be renewed. And there was a meeting. This was the only time he could do it, because he had to then drive immediately back here for a legislative session. Sat in on a hearing in the morning, a Senate session in the afternoon, then goes and picks up Mrs. Pinckney and their daughter at home, turns around, drives back to Charleston, and makes it down there in time for the quarterly conference to begin. The quarterly conference for the non-AMEs in the audience is a once every 3 months meeting with the presiding elder and the congregation. The presiding elder is the sort of the middleman in the AME bureaucratic structure between the bishops and the ministers. It would be unthinkable for a pastor to miss a quarterly conference at which the presiding elder was present. So he raced back to make that, and then gets there and is greeted by criticism from a church member who was the head of the religious education program at the church, who had been stewing for a while over his absences from various events. And she gets up and, with the elder sitting right next to him, delivers a speech about how disappointed she is in the pastor for not making it to, I think it was the vacation Bible school programs and graduation programs and things like this. So, tough situation to walk out of that and then into Bible study. Clearly he was affected by it. Other members said, you get the sense that as a politician, right, he knows that you've always got to be ahead of anything coming at you, right? You got to anticipate, and I don't think he anticipated that.
And how do you know what happened at the conference?
Talking to other members who were there.
How many people did you interview in the course of this book?
About 200.
Say that one more time.
About 200. Yeah. Not all church members, obviously. That includes historians, theologians, political figures, but certainly more than 100 members of the church, I'm sure.
People were willing to tell you what took place in the AME church conference meeting.
They told me some of it.
And let me just pause for a moment, because that too is what's surprising. You were informed of things which are unspoken facts and secrets of the church that I see in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, who are you? No, seriously, did you develop some level of familiarity and people felt comfortable talking to you about things of the church?
Well, the journalist's oldest trick is presence.
Did you hear that, John? Moore? Presence.
John has to write so much that he doesn't have the opportunity to be present that much. He has to file 5 times a day. And as a result, he only gets, he doesn't get to hang out for 9 months at a time on a story. Am I right? Have you ever hung out for 9 months at a time?
Yeah, I've spent 5 years on one.
Okay.
The president of the University of South Carolina was indicted and sent to prison.
All right. I stand corrected. I stand corrected. But my point is that when I talk about presence, and I'm kidding with John, but it's a different kind of presence in that it's hanging out. And I spent, the better part of 10 years hanging out at the church. My wife and I moved to Charleston in 2019 for about a 7 or 8 month period. I was there every Sunday, any time during the week that I'd be invited to something, any sort of function, I would go. And ultimately, talking to enough people, being there enough, having the chance to really explain to folks what you're up to, what you're about, what your goals are. Eventually, hopefully, you develop some trust. And it takes time. Needless to say, it really takes time when you walk into a situation like I did, where someone who's the same race that I am walked into a black church and destroyed the lives of 9 people and their family members and the community beyond them. So it was going to take some time, and I was fortunate to have it. I also, I don't know that I could have written this book at a different point in my career. I've done this for a fairly long time now. I've done a lot of immersive reporting having to do with race, some of it about the intersections of race and faith, the race and politics. I'd spent time before on an immersive story in a church. So I didn't come at it totally without preparation, without some sense of how I might go about it. And I also came at it, I think, with a very deep sense of the importance of the black church and the role of the black church, both spiritually and politically, and therefore for the level of desecration that had taken place at this church.
So I want to prepare everyone for an opportunity for you to ask Kevin questions, but I'd like my last question to really be about the last section of the book, 2 centuries of race, resistance, and forgiveness. And in that last section, you say something profound and powerful. Black Charlestonians have had a lot, almost like in minute detail, you outline all of the moments in history where this forgiveness has taken place.
Right.
This was, for me, one of the most frustrating parts of the book. This whole idea of forgiveness. You talk about the trial, you talk about the hearings, and you talk about how forgiveness is central, but often so misunderstood in the context of what took place in the summer of 2015, but also in the context of the Black church. So why end on this point of forgiveness?
I think that's really what the whole book was about. I mean, the search really was animated by trying to understand how it was that those family members, and there were 5 at the bond hearing, but also Chris Singleton, who did a television interview the night before the bond hearing, in which he expressed forgiveness for the shooter. How it was that those people had gotten up and said the things they did, expressed the forgiveness that they had for this 21-year-old white supremacist who less than 48 hours earlier had destroyed their lives. And it seemed to me that somewhere within the history of the church and the denomination, I might find the answer to that. I think maybe I felt instinctively, maybe it was because of my personal reaction to it, that the forgiveness that was offered toward Dylan Roof wasn't really for Dylan Roof, that it was for themselves. And as I interviewed each of the folks who had made these expressions of forgiveness, that was confirmed over and over again. It's really interesting. It was really an interesting part of the research to listen to them. They all, to a one, say, totally unpremeditated, not planned. You could not have told me that I would walk up to that microphone and forgive the man that had just killed my mother because she was Black, sitting in a church with her eyes closed in prayer. I'd never believe it. Had to be God talking. They talk about the notions of forgiveness that they have absorbed in church over time. Obviously, there's a great scriptural foundation for all of this, but it also seemed like there was something going on beyond the scriptural here. And I mean, ultimately what I conclude is that the forgiveness offered those days and in the subsequent days really was its own form of resistance. That it was a declaration by people who had been victimized that their victimization, the victimization of their family members wasn't going to extend to them for the rest of their lives. They were reasserting agency. And the ability to forgive was the one thing that murder could not take from them. And so it becomes almost, both in the context of 2015 and in the context of the 200 years, 400 years that preceded it, sort of this time-tested psychological protection mechanism, right? It's Felicia Sanders, who was lost her son and her aunt and survived the shootings herself, will tell you that she didn't do it for him. She did it because she needed a way to get out of bed every day and put one foot in front of the other. And that's her method.
We'll pause there. Comforter has a mic for those who have questions for our author.
I want to know if you got any resistance from the bishop when you were asking those personal questions about what goes on in an area church.
Which bishop?
Yeah, which bishop?
The bishop in that district.
Is she
Green,
seven?
Bishop,
And
Bishop,
the seventh because
Bishop Green. There were several over the course of the research. But Bishop Norris was the bishop at the time of the shootings.
Yeah, also just let people know you interviewed Bishop Green or talked to Bishop Green.
Bishop
John
Green.
Hurst Adams.
John Hurst Adams,
Preston Williams.
Preston Williams. I don't have an exact count, but probably half a dozen, 7, 8 maybe, of the current and former bishops. Bishop McKenzie. And I went to a general conference in the one in Orlando in 2021, which was hugely valuable for me.
You went to a general conference?
I went to a general conference. I went to all week long in Orlando too. Went to a South Carolina district conference, annual conference. And all of those were incredibly valuable for me, both because as an opportunity just to interview a lot of people, you know, in a condensed place and time, but just, again, just absorbing, just getting a feel for the culture and, you know, trying to understand what it's about. I did not get any, did I get any resistance? It took a while to get interviews with most of the bishops, I will say that. I couldn't, you know, I can't speak for them in saying what ultimately was persuasive, but I do think that, again, just being around and being seen and them knowing that I was around and I wasn't going away and that I had some specific questions about specific things. So for instance, with Bishop Norris, who is now deceased, we had a really interesting interview about the dismissal of Betty Dees Clark, who was the pastor who was appointed there in early 2016, first pastor appointed after the shootings. There was an interim pastor, Norvell Goff, who had been the presiding elder, and he filled in for the first 6 months. So there's finally a permanent replacement, first female pastor in the church's history, and seemed to be very well liked at the get-go, and I think was on her way towards, you know, doing what she could to heal the congregation, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that she was a woman and had sort of a motherly touch. Well, 6 months later, she was gone as fast as she arrived. And the book, I think, explains in ways that have not been known before exactly how it went down, thanks to an interview both with her and him. And what happened was she takes off and everyone remember the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando? That happens, and she at this point feels that as the pastor of Emanuel, she's got an obligation to be a spokeswoman against gun violence. And she gets a call from an advocacy group, will you come down? She says yes, she drives down. She does a couple of TV hits, a counseling session of some kind. She hasn't cleared it with Bishop Norris. And he's expecting her instead to be at a White House conference of some kind in Washington. Furthermore, all of this is happening right at the same time as the first anniversary of the shootings. And she's got commemorative responsibilities back at Emanuel, including leading a Bible study on the same chapter of Mark that had been read a year earlier, along with Anthony Thompson, the widower of one of the victims. He calls her and apparently expresses his discontent with this. She says otherwise, that he never really told her that he had a problem with what she was doing, but he did. And shortly after she returned, she gets back too late to make the Bible study, leaving Anthony Thompson to do it on his own. And that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And shortly after the bishop has her on the phone, and according to her, says literally, you are no longer, as of this minute, you are no longer the pastor of Emanuel AME Church. You're the pastor of, he assigns her to another church and replaces her. And she says, why are you doing this, Bishop? And he responds, in my godly judgment, which is the language used in the AME doctrine and discipline, essentially the bylaws for the power, the authority given to a bishop to make decisions on moving a minister. Just has to be out of his godly judgment. So he says, it's out of my godly judgment. She says, what else did God tell you? He says, just pack up your things and get out. And she did. So getting back, it was a long way of answering your question, which was about, did the bishops talk to me? Yeah, they did eventually. I think they were, somewhat circumspect at times. But, faced with, you have to put yourself in their position. I'm going to be writing about this. I've got her side of the story. It would make sense that he would want to give his.
I'm wondering if, is it
Yes, on.
I'm wondering if you can offer some insight into what your consideration process was when you were thinking about whether to take this project on, and particularly in the context of being white.
Well, I thought that I had a lot of advantages going in. I thought I had huge passion for the subject matter. I had endless curiosity. I mean, I was charged up about the research and the possibilities in ways that I have not been about anything else in the course of my career. I think I also came at it with a lot of experience. I mean, I'm 65 years old. I was 55 at the time I started. I've done a lot of this for major newspapers, done it at a high level, and a lot of the journalistic work that I'd done was, I think, as I mentioned before, sort of along the same lines, immersive, narrative kind of journalism. That said, I also had some distinct disadvantages. I'm not an African American. I didn't grow up in the church. In fact, I'm Jewish, not from South Carolina or Charleston. So I came at it as a total outsider in a lot of ways. And I was very aware of it from the get-go, and I hope that it meant that I proceeded with a lot of humility and a lot of caution and a lot of diligence. There's a reason that it took 10 years to finish the book. I was very sensitive to the fact that I would get things wrong, that there would be things that I didn't know, and most importantly, I think that there would be things that I could not feel or experience in the way that the people that I was writing about felt and experienced them. And the only way that I could compensate for that was by putting in the work. So yeah, I talked to 200 people, and I buried myself in the archives, and I really tried to think critically about every sentence that I wrote. We also submitted the manuscript to lots of early readers and intently readers who were African American, including a paid sensitivity reader, to go through the manuscript and look for places where I might have fallen short, and it was a really valuable process. So, readers will ultimately be the judge. I guess the last thing I would say about it is that while I recognized my shortcomings and my liabilities going into this, I also was aware that I'm a journalist, and this is what we do, right? So we travel in time and space and to different lands, and hopefully master the subject matter in a way that we're able to convey it back to our consumers in a way that is correct and fair and meaningful. And I wouldn't be interested in the profession if I was limited to doing it, to reporting and writing about subjects that I was intimately familiar with. The whole joy of it is going out in the world and trying to master something new. So I guess I'm just old school enough. If the question really is, who has the right to tell a story, right? And I think it's an important question, and it's the right question. I don't necessarily think that there should be limits. I don't think that only certain people should have the right to tell certain stories, but I think there's a real obligation to do the work necessary to earn the right to tell the story, and I hope I have.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. It looks like we have it. And Arthur will be hanging out after if you have some questions. We'll go down here. Can you speak in the mic from the live streamers?
Kevin, I've dipped into your book enough to know it's a great book, and I hope you find a very wide audience.
Thank you, John.
I think the wider the audience, the better. My question is, what were you sort of touched on this in what you just were saying, what were some of the major obstacles you found in doing the book, large and small?
Well, the largest obstacle, I would say, is just the dearth of records in this church's archive. The paper trail basically ended around 1940, and there really was nothing in the church's own documentation that existed before that. And so, there are gaps, there have to be gaps. I tried to fill them as best I could through secondary sourcing. Obviously, I spent a lot of time with the Charleston newspapers and, as I said, with the AME newspaper. But it sure would have been nice to have had, a real comprehensive archive from this church that went back for a century or so. Would have been a huge help. On a smaller scale, I don't know that it's really a smaller scale, but another obstacle was I had initially thought that I might write a chapter, about President Obama's construction. Because the eulogy, all remember the Amazing Grace eulogy, we remember it for the singing. But if you go back and look at it, and I've dozens of times, and I encourage all of you, so nice, take a look. It's really an amazing piece of work. And it was very simple in my own thinking about the book. By the time I walked out of that service that day, a lot was starting to click in my head because he was right on point with what I had already been thinking about in terms of the way this reflected the larger story of the Catholic Church. And so I spent a lot of time interviewing people around him. I talked to the speechwriter who had drafted the speech. I talked to Valerie Jarrett. I spoke to Josh Earnest, who was his press secretary at the time. I talked to Joshua Du Bois, who was his faith advisor, and got some great stuff, including from the speechwriter drafts of the speech as it was going through the process. So fascinating to look at, because the way it all happened was the murders take place, there are meetings in the White House. Obama sort of has to be persuaded to even come because it's so painful, and he's done so much of this. And I don't know that I've got anything new to say about gun violence. He's so frustrated that he can't get anything through the Republican Congress on guns, and he's just sort of throwing his hands up. And then the bond hearing happens. That's what I want to talk about. So since Woody Keenan, his speechwriter, off the a draft. I believe it's maybe Tuesday or Wednesday night for the following Friday's speech. And Obama sends Cody home, calls him back to the residence at 10 o'clock at night saying, you need to come back over here. And he hands him the draft. The first couple of pages, he has just scribbled all through. I mean, you know, if it was my editor doing it to me, I would need a drink. And then the last page, there's just an X. It's gone. The whole thing is gone. And he's replaced it on a leaf pad in his handwriting, just rewritten the whole thing, structuring it all around Amazing Grace. And so when I got these, I was like, oh, yeah, this is such great material, and you know, I can do so much with this. Missing piece, Obama. He's got a perfectly good reason, which is that he's writing his own memoirs. He's released the first half. He has not released the second half yet. That's the part that will include. So for some reason, he did not want to allow me to preempt his own book, and I'm trying not to resent that. But so it never happened. The other thing that happened is, I don't know if it was because of our conversations, but after our conversations, even the speechwriter went and wrote his own book. So at that point, I thought, well, it's kind of been written, and I don't have the key figure, and the speech became 2 sentences. So instead of a part of a chapter. You know how that goes.
It's okay, I can probably talk loud, I used to be a school teacher. Do you find in journalism that you are impacted, your spirituality is impacted,
Mm-hmm.
and that you are changed in what you learn, and I wonder, is that part of what you cover in the book? Or could you just say something about that?
Yeah. I'll bisect the question a little bit. I think John will agree, and John and I got to know each other because we covered the trial together. And I don't know if you felt this way, but for me, it was, you know, it wasn't covering a war zone or the aftermath of an earthquake, but it was as traumatizing emotionally, I think, for everyone in the courtroom, as including the journalists, as anything that we've sat through. And it was interesting. I had an experience with Pastor Emanuel, the current pastor of the church. I was doing a piece during the trial about how it affected family members and church members who were sitting in the courtroom watching every day. And I remember grabbing the pastor during a break to interview him about this. And after a couple of questions, he kind of looked at me and said, well, but how are you? You know, how are you doing with all this? And it kind of hadn't occurred to me until that point that it was a question that might need asking. But as I thought about it, it occurred to me that, you know, I don't know that I'm so good. You know, this is pretty tough stuff to listen to and watch day after day. The other part of the question is about, I guess, my faith. And I don't know that doing the book deepened my faith or made me personally a more faithful person, but I think it unquestionably deepened my understanding of faith and the power of faith to move in people's lives. And you can't sit in this church for the time that I've spent there and not feel that.
All right, well, thank you so much. Can we give a warm round of applause for Emanuel? As Dr. Donaldson mentioned, we have a very special guest with us today. The daughter of B.J. Glover, Gail Glover, is here, and she wanted to do a presentation for author Kevin Sack.
Oh, Gail. Really? Oh, my goodness.
Just want to thank you so much. When you all read the book, you'll learn a lot about my dad and who he was and who he still continues to be. Not a day goes by that somebody doesn't call his name to me. So we wanted to present you with this resolution, if I may read it. A resolution from the family of Reverend Dr. Benjamin James Glover to Mr. Kevin Sack, author of Mother Emanuel. Whereas the late Reverend Dr. Benjamin James Glover devoted his life to spiritual leadership, civil rights advocacy, and the betterment of his community through faith, education, and action. And whereas Reverend Dr. Glover's life and legacy are deeply rooted in the pursuit of justice, the uplifting of Black lives, and the moral imperative to serve, mentor, and lead with integrity and humility. And whereas Mr. Kevin Sack, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of Mother Emanuel, has honored the memory of the Emanuel Nine and the broader legacy of Black faith leaders by including the life, work, and enduring impact of Reverend Dr. Benjamin James Glover in his writing. And whereas the family of Reverend Dr. Benjamin James Glover recognizes the historical and cultural significance of Mother Emanuel and deeply appreciates the care, accuracy, and dignity with which Mr. Sack conveyed Reverend Glover's story and contributions. Now, therefore, be it resolved that we, the family of Reverend Dr. Benjamin James Glover, do hereby extend our heartfelt gratitude to Mr. Kevin Sack for lifting our father's legacy to national and international audiences. Be it further resolved that we affirm the importance of honoring our elders and ancestors by preserving their stories for future generations. And we commend Mr. Sack for helping to ensure that Reverend Glover's voice continues to speak through the pages of Mother Emanuel. Be it finally resolved that a copy of this resolution be shared with Mr. Sack as a token of our appreciation and as a lasting expression of the love and pride we carry for Reverend Dr. Benjamin James Glover, husband, father, pastor, and servant of God. Humbly submitted.
Yeah. I will cherish that my whole life. That was so wonderful. Thank you so much. That makes me feel so good. Y'all know they haven't read the book yet, so. So we'll see what the resolution says in a couple of weeks. Thank you, Gail. That was amazing.
Once again, let's give a big round of applause for our author and moderator. Thank you so much for being here today. And he will be out in the atrium signing books. But before y'all leave, y'all can get up and go. If y'all, can you bring the movie screen down? We have another special guest here. Did Rose make it out today? Oh, there she is. You want to come down front? So Reverend Daniel Simmons, one of the victims of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, his daughter Rose has recently made a film about his life that is going to be screening at the Nickelodeon Theater at 7:30 tonight. And she was gracious enough to come out and join us today. So Rose, would you
Great. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be here for these few minutes. This is my mother. I put this film together. It took me about 2 years. As you know, there were 9 victims and 5 survivors. My father was the last remaining survivor. He was the last one to pass away. And I entitled the film One Last Breath. A lot of times when you have multiple mass shooting, people's lives and how they live kind of gets lost in the grouping of that. So it's very important for me to let you know who he was and that he wouldn't, and if you allow me to say it, just be a number, but you would know his life and even more importantly, his death. So I thank you for taking a few minutes to just look at the trailer. We will be over, as Kevin said, at the Nickelodeon in a few minutes. This is our second day of showing the film in theaters. Thank you.
see, it's still screen mirror rate. That's the problem. I can't get that to cut off. I was working earlier. I know. I turned this off earlier. Yes, there. Just keep using Command plus F1. That's what I did.
All right, so unfortunately, it does not look like a